Hola a todos, bem-vindos. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology in Lisbon. I am Beatrice Leanza, I'm the director of the museum. And we are here today on a very special occasion, given once again the times we are living in. And on the occasion, of one of the key events for one of the three key projects that we're presenting here at MAT until September 6th, which is the exhibition X is Not a Small Country, Unraveling the Post-Global Era. The show has been co-curated by Aric Chen and Martina Muzi, and it is a special day today because somehow we have managed to bring together, to collate, most of the participants to this incredible exhibition, which is made of 9 key projects, the large part of which have in fact been specifically developed for the show. And somehow in a miraculous feat, Aric and Martina have managed to pull together in a series of fantastic conversations that have happened in fact as the pandemic unraveled. And as in fact the show was conceived prior to its outbreak, the topics, the issues, and in fact, the intellectual trajectories that traverse the show, I think, have made much more, sense and brought much more relevance to the everyday conversation that we engage with nowadays. So I don't want to take too much time off today's special day, but it's really a pleasure to introduce the people that are sitting with me today physically on site in real life. Today is going to unfold in fact in a hybrid format. So we have this fantastic guests, others that will be joining online, including Aric himself. And we have Martina Muzi, the co-curator of the show, Jing He, that reaches out from Eindhoven. And then we have Ronald Rael and Virginia San Fratello that join us from the States. So many more are the guests that we see now, joining us online. But I will let, in fact, Aric then, introduce them and explain a little bit of the format of today's event and what is going to happen. So, Aric, I am giving you the stage, the virtual stage, to introduce the rest. Thank you very much, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, and I'm sorry that that I and the other virtual speakers cannot be there with all of you today, but I think the fact that we're all here but not here at the same time really does speak to the condition that the show is investigating, in which we are in a world that is increasingly both fragmented and intertwined, and yet still intertwined at the same time. As you mentioned, Bea, the show was conceived before the pandemic, when it was things like Brexit and trade wars and rising nationalism and notions of internet sovereignty and so on and so forth that were beginning to reconfigure notions of the global, or at least the global that we have known since, let's say, the 1990s, where things were becoming much more, and are becoming much more sort of complex and intertwined, while being intertwined and entangled, sort of fragmenting and in these sort of convoluted, sometimes contradictory, and even counterintuitive ways, a world in which pathways that we once took for granted could suddenly close up. And this is again before the pandemic even, while things that once seemed inconceivable could suddenly open up. And hence, we're going to talk about open and closed today in the context of the show. The show was, for those of you who are there, as you can see, it was meant to be really a sort of landscape investigating through various practices, this kind of post-global condition via through objects, bodies, territories, geographies, and looking and sort of reflecting on both the past, looking at the present, but also speculating about the future. And we're really fortunate that we have 5 of the authors, the artists, designers, and studios of those 9 projects here with us today. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of break down the overarching sort of aim of the show or investigation of the show into, let's say, 3 smaller fragments by focusing on, well, mostly in pairs, but also singularly some of the projects which together, in this case, show us, sort of create an analogy between what's happening in the US versus Saudi Arabia, the circulation of objects across the border between, and the highly contested border actually, between China and India. And then we have Jing He and Liam Young. We'll introduce all of these guys a little bit more later, who are going to show us their work that gives us hints as to how we might imagine these forces playing out or not playing out well into the future. So we're going to try and make this snappy, and we have 3 sessions. There's a slight change to the schedule, and we're actually going to start off with a dialogue looking at illicit spaces between Ronald Rael and Virginia San Fratello of Oakland-based Rael San Fratello, and Abdulrahman Gazaz and Turki Gazaz of Jeddah-based Brick Lab. Abdulrahman is in Jeddah today. Turkey's in Riyadh, actually, and then Ron and Virginia are there with you all in Lisbon. So maybe, and also we should just say that we'll do these in short sessions of about 20 to 30 minutes each, but we will leave a little time for a question or two from the live studio audience or also from online. So please do feel free to join in, everybody. So session 1 then is again looking at the notion of illicit spaces, and Ron and Virginia, who are in Lisbon now, are actually sitting in the installation by Brick Lab called Tactile Cinema, looking across onto their installation of the Teeter-Totter Wall, which is a recreation of an intervention they did first in 2019 at the US-Mexico border wall, where they inserted these sort of pink seesaws through that wall, thus allowing for at least 40 minutes people on both sides of that border to play with each other. Whereas the installation Tactile Cinema by Brick Lab, where you're all sitting at Matt, is kind of a reflection, and I'll let Abdulrahman and Turki talk about it more themselves, but it's a bit of a reflection look on the past 30 years of cinema, or cinematic space, or cinema spaces, I should say, in Saudi Arabia, beginning with their investigation beginning in the early 80s, when the rise of hardline religious conservatism produced a ban on those spaces, a well-known ban on those spaces in Saudi Arabia, but that has, of course, been reversed in recent years. And so we'll really be happy to hear from them a little bit more about that. So to begin with, I don't know, Ron, Virginia, or Abdulrahman, or Turki, I mean, we're framing your projects in terms of illicit spaces. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between architecture, architects, and illicit spaces, to the extent that you're both confronting this idea in very different ways with your project.
Sure, hi Eric. I'll begin. I think there's this perception around the world, but also in the United States, that the border is in fact an illicit space. But we wanted to challenge that because in fact the border is a public space. This is a federally funded project with government funds, often on lands that are not forbidden, but these are sometimes public lands. They are private lands that people own. They're national wildlife areas. They're Native American lands. And so rather than see the border as an illicit space, we wanted to demonstrate that in fact it is a public space and people can engage that landscape in a way that they can claim it and own it as their own. And I think bringing this installation to the museum also maybe is an inversion of that in some strange way, in that we are now bringing a space which is seen as illicit to a new public. So it was important for us to, it was very difficult for us to make the decision to build this in a museum, take it out of its context, but in fact, it became more and more important through the conversations of how we would demonstrate to the world the violence of that structure, and how important it is to kind of put it in the context of people to see and say, look what's going on. This is the reality there. Look at the amount of material and physical energy and expense at the cost of money, but also human lives, and just look, in a way, marvel at the horror of that and reconcile with that.
Yeah, and I'll just build on that and say, the border wall is a taxpayer-funded project. It is public property, just like a courthouse is, or a public park, right, in a city, and everyone has access to that. And so by bringing play to that space that is perceived as being illicit or inaccessible, we made it available and accessible. Also, this wall, it runs through people's backyards. It is literally like a fence in someone's backyard, right? And that allowed us to bring the children who lived in these communities and the houses that back up to the border wall out to play with us. And when we were there playing, of course, probably half of the children there were, or half of the people there were children, and most of the adults there were women, which is not something that we had anticipated. But I think because of the gender and the age of the participants, we were able to create this kind of sanctuary space that again prevented it from being or feeling illicit, right? It made it feel very open, very public, very normal, just something that you would see anywhere in the United States, mothers and children playing in a park together. And so when Border Patrol came or the Mexican police came, they saw that and they said, "What are you doing here?" And we said, "Well, we're just playing with the children." And so it was okay, it was not illicit, it was not controversial in that moment, so to speak. It was permissible.
No, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to hear you say that, because initially I would have said it wasn't the space that was, or you made that space public, or you heightened its publicness through an illicit act. But I guess you're saying now that what was in fact an illicit act, because you're inserting those, you're breaching the wall with those teeter-totters was not authorized, of course. But having made that illicit act, you suddenly kind of defanged its illicitness.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. We dismantled the nature that it's an illicit space by making that insertion, not normalizing the brutality of the wall, but actually normalizing relationships between people.
Yeah.
That should be normal.
That's a nice way of putting it. Turkey and Abdul Rahman.
I think for us it was we were kind of questioning how do we showcase this idea of film itself being illicit, and with coming up with our installation and really transforming the films that are being seen inside, but also transforming this notion of forbidden cinema spaces in Saudi. I think we really tried to translate it through the materiality itself. Our initial idea was to kind of touch on the notions of cinema starting at a certain period in time past, and then kind of the Wahhabi police came and stopped everything, and that so the whole cinema experience has become almost like a TV static. And we tried to translate that into something that's more tactile. So how do you touch, how do you feel, how do you interact in person with almost a static television screen? So it's also these notions of people kind of touching on it and creating these electricities, when you kind of touch these surfaces. And it's kind of, so every time you touch another person, you recreate this electrical moment, which is kind of the power behind film and TV and all of that in a more technical sense. But also we try to create these different notions of open and closed spaces where you can enter the cinema and kind of close these places, but also kind of when we worked with Royce and Falcone as well to come up with a film series, it's also about kind of showcasing this almost international sense of what at least Jeddah, of what Jeddah used to be. Jeddah is a port city, and it was a very, very open city in terms of knowledge exchange and all of these things. So for us, it was this, and of course, the very fact of it being behind the border wall in the context of the exhibition becomes really, really interesting, because it really talks about now the cinema ban has been lifted by higher ups. We can now finally go to cinema, but around these periods of time, everyone kind of either had a cinema in their home. Before that, there used to be garden cinemas before the cinema ban happened, which was a public space. These are kind of how the masses of our installation kind of resonate with all of these open and closed spaces, but also the forum in the middle that everyone's sitting on. And I think it becomes a wider conversation about how do we occupy spaces and how do we kind of almost touch and feel all of these kind of filmmakers that are sprouting about kind of countrywide, whether before the ban or after the ban, in a more social aspect. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think for us, the topic of cinema and the relationship between cinema and architecture was an interesting, highlighted the relationship between what is illicit or what is banned formally by law, and how that actually creates an effect on the cultural production of film and its reception and the relationship that Saudi society has with film as a cultural activity. So I think the ban really was about the cinema spaces. So the closed room, the dark closed room where people are going to watch films. That's what was essentially banned, because satellite TV was allowed. It was playing in cafes. It was playing in restaurants, and people actually gathered to watch games. Sometimes they'd watch movies. Sometimes they'd watch live performances. But it's the space of the cinema that was actually was forbidden by law. And it's interesting to see how that has really hindered progress on local production of film and general attitudes that society had with film. Film has, over these past 30 years, when film was banned, it's always received as an import. Saudi society consumes movies from Egypt or different places of the Arab world or the US mainly. And there's a disconnect that happened. And now when people go watch Saudi films and see Saudi actors on stage and Saudi cities on the screen, there is a sense of alienation, because it was never commonplace, and it was actually banned and forbidden during this period.
Also, Martina, please feel free to jump in, or in fact, and anybody, please feel free to jump in. But what I like about what you said, Turkey, just now was that you explained that it wasn't the activity that was banned; it was the space that was banned, right? Whereas, I guess, at least in theory, Ron and Virginia, it was sort of the opposite. It was your activity that was sort of illicit, at least in theory, and whereas the space, the border was sort of authorized, or at least implemented through the dominant sort of power structures, let's say. And in some ways, this kind of speaks to a kind of reversal between a broader reversal that your two projects kind of hint at. Ron and Virginia, you were trying to breach or open up a wall that had a very menacing wall that's been of course very high on the agenda for certainly under the Trump administration, in a country that sort of is built on a mythology of openness, whereas Abdul Rahman and Turkey, you are talking about a situation in which the opening of cinemas reflects a broader agenda to open up in a country that has long been seen as kind of hopelessly closed. So the kind of almost irony of this really stands out for us. And as architects, it would be interesting to hear how you guys respectively see the global evolving from your different vantage points.
I mean, I think, if I may start off, I think that definitely the Saudi Arabia's agenda to open up really is really a desire to connect with a global culture, and I think that really that the idea of allowing cinema was a huge step to legitimize or to actually make common importing the film into the country. And I think it really highlights the role that film plays in shaping society and how individuals react to films and are affected by film. So I think the question of the global practice becomes very interesting at this critical point, because in the 30 years when cinema was banned, I think architects as cultural practitioners were really, in Saudi at least, were functioning in a vacuum, where there was no, where architecture was really about building buildings and the technical discussion about how to make a building as efficient as possible. And at this point, we're really speaking about architecture as a space that is, creating culture and symbolizing a specific moment in time. And I think with the commission that we are working on now with the Art Jamid space in Jeddah was really supported as a Saudi rendition of a cinema space, a localized cinema space that is different from the AMCs and the Vox theaters that are showing foreign film, that are showing blockbuster movies. So I think as architects, it's an exciting moment to be part of this conversation, because finally we can speak about architecture not just as a building and an engineering kind of discipline, but really speak to it as it relates to other cultural activities and how it can support and foster these activities.
Yeah, you mentioned the previous regime's agenda about building more walls, but in fact, very few walls were actually built during that regime of Trump. And so I think what we're trying to open up is a conversation about what is actually happening, bringing like global awareness to what is actually happening in a very local place, a very local condition. And so for us, this idea of the global practice is to, I think this idea of the global practice has changed in the time when there was a movement towards thinking globally and acting locally. But in fact, I think we want to tell stories to the world that are local, and we can do it through these kind of communication channels now, through social media and through the kind of access we have globally to share intellectual and factual knowledge in a time of truthiness when what is often shared is lies. And so I think what we're trying to do in our practice, especially with the work on the US-Mexico border, is tell the stories of a very local place that actually affects people around the world. Because we have been suffering a time in history where we are building physical walls, but we're also building walls between us in very different ways, between cultures, between religions, between identities, and how might we break those walls down? And I think one of those ways is to tell truths, and that people can listen to those truths if we're showing them what is actually happening. And for us, I think this project, the Teeter-Totter Wall, told new kinds of truths, told truths of the stories of the people who are living there, that this is not a landscape where no one lives and bad men are doing bad things, but in fact, it's a place where women and children live and live life and experience joy despite the oppression of the wall. And so this is kind of our agenda with this work, is just to tell the story of what is actually happening. I think Virginia has some other thoughts about.
It's also amazing how technology is allowed to transcend borders, right? Even today, because of the way that we're live streaming, but we can't be together in person. And when we were there at the border that day, of course, people couldn't pass from one side of the wall to the other, but we had a drone that could fly over from one side to the other. And then of course, this project was disseminated on Instagram, so that put it out into the world. Like that was the vehicle, right? The technology that allowed us to do that. We've also taken robot arms to the border between the United States and Mexico and 3D printed with local soil. So thinking about technology and emerging technologies and how those can transcend borders and boundaries. We've been developing software applications that lower the bar to entry so that you don't have to have 10,000 hours of 3D modeling or 3D printing experience, right? That you can be a child, you can be in 5th grade, and you can use this open, easy access software to learn how to model and 3D print something within 5 or 10 minutes. So we're trying to, I think, be global in that way, and software and technology allows us to do that, but then look at very local materials like soil or clay, or very local, hyper-specific context like the border wall between the United States and Mexico, and marry those to think about the future, right? To ask these open-ended questions about the future, what is global and what is local, and what do we keep and what do we disrupt? Yeah.
If I can link to that, I mean, the fact of playing in the urban space as much as watching a movie is indeed global, but locally it acquires different, or it carries different limitation to the point of becoming illicit in certain spaces, for example. So I think and this is more like for who is not now in the museum here, it's really beautiful to see those two projects standing next to each other, because in a way you can trace many connections and many disconnections in a way, for the materiality, for how the shape. One is a line, and the other one is more like a square, public square. So I think in both of the project, this concept of open and close, it is carried along for two different scales. Really from the scale of the sit, that has a specific story potentially also, why you guys choose that sit, or why Brick Lab choose 3 different projections, and one is enclosed, one is covering, and the other one is indeed open. So I think the two projects carry those scales from the importance of the object that also creates while telling the truth, it creates a connection, right, to who is listening, to reaching the point of political and international and between countries, which is like geopolitical narratives in a way. So 2 countries next to each other, divided by a wall, but also a country which is close to the rest of the other countries. The question maybe, which is interesting, is that how, through your practices as architects, how do you carry along this friction between open and close at different scales, which here is a really beautifully, we can go around and interact with in a way. So.
I think one thing that's consistent in all of our projects, which are very diverse and different, is that we intervene. We really like to intervene into systems. So we might intervene into a political system by redirecting or bringing attention to a certain situation, which of course is what we've done here with the border wall. So we've intervened in the way people perceived of this space. we like to intervene with 3D printing, for example. These are very expensive technologies, very expensive materials, and we've intervened by hacking printers and putting our own materials in them. So we intervene in commercial and proprietary systems. And there are some other projects where we have intervened in kind of social systems or social misconceptions and tried to highlight, I think, plight of people, homelessness, for example, in the United States, to speak to, I think, the fact that anyone could be homeless, right? We, in California, have experienced so many wildfires, and any one of us could find ourselves in that situation. So in our practice and in our architecture, we're intervening to bring attention to and to hopefully make change. I mean, that would be the ultimate goal, right? To have an impact.
Yeah, these kind of interventions are always about asking questions. And in research, when you ask questions, there are basically two kinds of research questions you can ask. You could ask closed questions, and you can ask open questions. Closed questions are questions where the answer is either yes or no. An open question is a question that dives much deeper into the details. And we like those open questions. Is it easy to say we're for or against the border wall? That's easy. The answer is yes or no. But the questions of why the border wall exists, how does it affect the people, how does it affect the landscape, what are the conditions that are occurring, the consequences of the construction, those are the questions I think that need to be answered. And so those are the questions we like to take on with our practice, open questions.
Yeah. Responding to what we inherit in a specific context also, both as technology, as infrastructures. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Guys,
I mean,
I actually don't know how much time we have still. There is not a time count.
Maybe Abdurrahman can.
You appear and disappear on the screen, so we have to, it's a kind of... But you are here now. It's nice to see you again.
I think you go ahead.
So, I mean, I think in our practice, we're always engaging with the idea of open and closed, and how we can really heighten the awareness of openness and closed spaces using these physical elements like wall, ceiling, and the ground. So I think and this is something that we experiment a lot with in most of our design work. What constitutes an open space? So the block on the right, or my right at least, is semi-open. So you crawl in and you occupy a space where you can actually see other people moving around in the museum space. The other one has a physical curtain and creates a full enclosure. And the steps that you're sitting on are really is open in the museum hall. So we're always trying to allow the experience of the installation to register these notions of openness and open and closed experiences by virtue of the physical objects that constitute the space. And obviously the way that each of these steps or the seats are also designed is to allow the person who's sitting to be aware of the different postures. So moving between an inclined seat back to evoke notions of informal occupancy of a space versus the steps that you're sitting on, which bring in a number of people and allow different interactions to happen. And just actually watching Martina address the participants and looking at the screen is really something that is really an observation that we continuously integrate into our future designs to see how people interact with these physical objects.
I think
Okay,
also
we
from
have
another
a... Oh, sorry.
perspective-
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to kind of touch upon something that you guys might find interesting. It's basically, I was just talking to Aric. We're working on an installation for another show, which requires us to pour, and part of our idea is to pour silicone in various locations in Jeddah, and it's kind of like a skin of the city. And it really makes you question the difference between kind of, in terms of open and closed, it's also kind of what's public and what's not. And for me to be able to go and pour the silicone, let's say, by the Corniche, by the ocean front, I actually have to get a permit to do that. So, I mean, there's something that we always kind of play around with conceptually is what is, in terms of public spaces here, they're kind of always designated spaces or they're destination points. So for me to be able to go to a public space and use it to pour a pink blob onto the floor, which is kind of very, I guess, flashy, although it's not really, is really interesting because it makes you question how do we occupy our cities in a place that's really trying to connect with the rest of the world. And it's just these simple notions of doing these things really kind of opens up your eyes about physically occupying a space and physically being present in a place of that sort, which I think is quite interesting. Is it open? Is it public? Is it not? So it's the urban fabric of our city is quite jumbled in that way. And I think that's, again, the configuration of these three different spaces really says it all in that respect, that it's kind of a mashup of these different things.
I got a question on my phone that I can maybe read loud, actually two. We mentioned the different body positions that this installation permit and encourage. I guess that was me mentioning before. But the question is, how are physical bodies affected by these kinds of open, closed, illicit public architectures? So a bit, Abdurrar, is a bit like what you were also connecting to, but also what, Virginia, you were explaining at the beginning, how the connection to play. I don't know if you want to explore a bit this question, or the other one is, does a work like the teeter-totter wall lose some of its effectiveness if it turns permissible? That's, I think it's an interesting one. I don't know how we want to, I'll leave it to you.
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Does it, I mean, yeah, it's not needed if it's permissible to.
It's just a playground.
It's
right?
just a playground,
and
right.
There are millions of teeter-totters all around the world already, right?
Right. So I think the important thing in that work is that the wall disappears.
Yeah.
Millions of dollars worth of steel disappear at that moment, and it's just a playground.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing to remember, that their bodies in space balanced, and there's metaphors there about equality, equanimity, and pleasure and joy that are occurring between the bodies in space. But this question about is it, you know, we don't want to. You know, an interviewer once interviewed me and asked, so this was such an interesting project. Do you want there to be more walls so there could be more teeter-totters?
Oh.
And it was the most ridiculous question. In fact, no, like, this is about dismantling a system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a larger piece of this project that is about recuerdos or souvenirs. And we have this vision that, you know, one day the wall will be gone. And what's left? And maybe what's left are playgrounds, right? And maybe we only remember the wall as something diminutive or small that's in a souvenir. It's something that is so far gone from our memory that we have to have a tiny physical artifact to remember it.
Because we have to remember. I mean,
yeah, we have to remember it. It's important. But what we're left with is the play and the togetherness and that bridge from my country to your country, right?
Thank you. Briklav, do you want to say something else? Or we can also move on. I think we are on right time to go to the next dialogue.
I mean, I think the question of occupying the space and the bodily postures is something that we really believe encourages certain behavior in a space. So if you have your back reclined, I would assume you take a position that is a bit more informal. Like you can't, you have to sort of let go of some of your belongings that are with you, your bags, and sort of sit down and, relax while you're watching the film. And this is sort of like a translation of the process of the initial cinemas, where they were actually hosted in people's homes, and they were essentially, gathering chairs, and then as occupancy was getting higher, people would just sit on the floor. So it was a very informal, very different from the process of entering a cinema space and being assigned a seat, and having your cup holder and having your popcorn right next to you. I think and also it's a different experience when you're sitting in like a forum setting. So you don't have a back. You're not comfortable to sit for long hours of time, and you're also sharing a bench with others. So I think all of these are these are just they're, I think, design questions, and just seeing how people interact with them and how we can develop them into architectural works.
Thank you.
I think actually Abdul Rahman unfortunately has to take off, right? We don't want to keep you very engagement.
Thanks for making it.
Yeah, thanks for making.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us.
Good to see you guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
We can go to the next conversation, which is named On the Circulation of Objects and Capital with Bar Studio. Hi guys, do you hear us? We have Rupali and Prasad. Hi, from Mumbai, I guess.
Yes.
Yes,
Nice to see you.
you too.
Nice to be here.
Rupali and Prasad have an architecture urban studio, bar studio, and they presented here a project which is at different scales of its own, in a way. Let's say that, just to introduce you a bit your practice, you work with different medias, from writing, curating, also for like through installations, but also through publications. And you have also a series of research projects. So what we see here is, in a way, like a manifestation, a three-dimensional aspect of your work in different ways, because there is an installation which is really architectural, which I'm watching right now, but is also in the back of of Rupali, which contains objects, but also objects of different forms, with specific objects which transit globally from China to India. But also there is a series of, there is a publication which collects a beautiful, almost like a contemporary archaeological work that you guys have been doing and published within the show. So all these different scales in this red island, which is called, the installation is called Itinerant Desires. That tells a lot. So maybe you can guys tell us what does it contain, not only in terms of, not necessarily in terms of object, but in terms of movements between the two main countries that have been, these objects are connected to, which are China and India, of course.
Sure. I mean, you can see the installation behind Rupali. Actually, in many ways it fuses urban form, narratives, objects which are moving, and in this space of the gallery, it kind of produces a moment for bodies to pass through this fusion of urban form, objects, and narratives, actually. And I think I mean, the previous discussion was that there is a lot of mention of global, local, inside, outside. I mean, for I think more than 2,000 years, the connection between China and India has been active, and the way we refer to global local today is really the Cold War hangover. It's kind of the global look has been quite blurred, across centuries, across geographies otherwise. And I think some of the main players are the traders, the big ones, but this work looks at small traders actually, who moves immensely. So while there is this big narrative, this nationalist narrative, nationalizing narrative of tension, conflict, boundaries, etc., there are these thousands of small traders who move, carry material, carry objects, and the border is not only restricted to land, but across sea, mountains, all kinds of terrains are navigated, and we bring together these objects, which we call them usual and unusual objects, and these objects tell the story of these movements, these journeys, and not only that, but I mean, if you look at the objects very carefully, they're very like an invisible ink pen, Now, why would somebody make them and sell them at less than 15 cents, 15 US dollar cents in Bombay? And why would somebody buy them? And once bought, then they use it for a couple of days, and then it remains in somebody's cupboard or some drawer, and it remains there, and then kind of and then after a couple of years it is thrown away, and then it enters into the recycling industry and becomes something else. So there is a folding in of strange desires, strange designs, strange markets, strange kind of connections, recycling industries, which these objects hold, and that's what we were interested in kind of telling the story, but also not only telling the story, but also how it reshapes urban form, because they occupy strange places. They also kind of bring about strange aspirations amongst people. So we were trying to hold all of it together to tell the story between India and China, really, like this complex story, which is otherwise said in very flat terms of disputes and conflicts and separations and contradictions, really. So that was. Really, you want to add a few things?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's what in the media you sort of start hearing stories of the conflict that happens, gets escalated, but I think like a lot of this kind of narrative is also mobilized for certain reasons, and those can be to win elections and all kinds of things, but on the ground things are much more granular. And that's what this work shows, that it's really about politics of the everyday, where where the ground is really made of solidarities, friendships, idiosyncrasies, all kinds of trips and kicks, the afterlives of the financial circuits, which really sort of makes this ground, and it's a very different kind of granular politics that then operates. And we were really sort of interested in these objects. And, there's this, the cultural theorist Kopitov or Arjuna Padurai speak about the cultural life of objects, cultural biographies of objects, the social life of objects, which have in some ways lives much beyond their use values and their exchange values. And these were the cultural biographies that we were interested in, and the trajectories that kind of, transcend the move between nations and create this very granular everyday politics, which in many ways is much more emancipatory than, than what we could imagine. And I think a lot of this is not spoken about. It kind of gets hijacked in some ways in these meta-narratives. And so that's what we were interested in bringing.
But maybe Rupali or Prasad, it'd be great to hear how, yes, your focus was on the sort of granular cultural biographies of these objects. But as we've sort of mentioned, kind of already, while you were working on this project, the sort of broader geopolitical realm kind of came into the picture, right? We had these conflagrations along the disputed Himalayan border between China and India, got a lot of attention. The situation really escalated. The Indian government then banned all Chinese apps, from the Indian internet. Of course, there was a lot of stuff going on this side of the border as well. I'm in Shanghai, if we haven't mentioned that already. So I mean, how does that filter on the ground? Do you think? I mean, are there political narratives at the granular level at work as well?
So there's a lot of symbolism. Which get played out and mobilized also. So the most powerful symbol, which kind of went through many social media coverages as well as mainstream media coverages, was this television being thrown out of the fourth floor, a Chinese-made television being thrown out of the fourth floor in one of the big cities, and then people kind of stepping over it, and as if kind of boycotting Chinese goods. So that's this kind of things went on for some time, and I think for me the question was, which is the next television he's going to buy or she's going to buy, or the family is going to buy, and because it is either going to come from another company in China or from a Chinese-owned company from Taiwan or somewhere else, or companies in India which have Chinese stakes in them. So it's kind of and the other question for me was also, what happens to this television after it is thrown? Because it is picked up slowly, gathered, and then it goes into the recycling market, and then it has another life after that. Like precious metals are kind of extracted, and then the circuit boards which are operative are still kind of enter into another a second-hand market, and all kinds of things go on with it. The national narratives have been very active, and mobilized for a variety of reasons, and it is never possible to speculate what are the exact reasons for the national narratives to take place. And nobody knows. People who are scripting the narratives also do not know, I feel, that how it gets worked out and stuff like that. And the border issues with China, Pakistan, Bangladesh have been very, very kind of active since past 40 years, 30 years or so. And so this is not unusual for India to kind of or in the media to see these escalations and these kind of sudden sparks of conflicts. But we also record in our narratives, that alternative routes are found. People move because there is a country called Nepal between China and India, and you pass through Nepal, and then you are not really going to China, nor you are coming to India. You are going to Nepal, and then from Nepal, then you kind of cross borders, and then you move into somewhere else, and and all kinds of short circuits are new circuit routes are worked out. So it's a, like, I would say that there is a narrative which is kind of, which is put in place for public consumption. It is kind of, and these are narratives which are like, and there's nothing true or untrue about them. They're kind of, they are narratives. They are narratives around which many concepts of nationalisms get played out, and many things get played out. But you see closely, you go dig deeper, and then they kind of, they blur, and then they kind of, they smudge away. So that's how we read the geopolitical condition, so to say. Gopal, you want to add anything?
No, I think that's fine.
This leads to another question that we had in mind, which is, and is also readable within the books that you presented within the installation, which is how those objects can be lenses to also to explore the politics that is carried through the objects themselves, but also some phenomena which are happening globally. For example, how technology is disposed, what happens after technology is disposed, where does it travel, in which part of the world, mostly towards the south. What does it mean to transport technological devices which are dumped in one part of the world and arrive, which kind of ecosystem they create around. You guys talk also about peripheral technology. So would you like to maybe extract something on this line of the after, like the politics also, how the object, when they are disused, they still carry, or maybe they transform the politics from which they were born, for example, or produced. Because I think I want to put that I want to underline the publication that you guys did, because I think there are really fantastic notions inside there.
Yeah. I think that's where even the form of the narrative becomes important, to look at really the kind of nuances in the way the kind of ground operates, because in some ways what it does is that it sort of really sort of opens up the stories of solidarities, friendships, and other things. The story, and this is something that we've been very interested in. A lot of these stories are montages. They are not sort of only ethnographic tales, but they are montages. They fuse together many narratives, and in that sense, they also become patterns. And they become thick stories of cities in the way they kind of open up these narratives. And we've been interested really in the form of the semi-fiction, to look at urban stories through. Often because also when you tell stories directly, there's a lot of people do not want to be want their stories to be told, because they operate tactically in multiple ways. And what these sort of narratives do is that they create this kind of semi-fictional form, which really sort of talks about the densities, the intensities, the thicknesses in which cities operate, without really sort of exposing some of these practices. So I think that's what, the nuances of the stories and the way the drawings work, the photographs kind of come in, the stories kind of start getting thickened. And I think that's what we were interested in sort of bringing these. And there are 9 stories, but they're all interconnected 9 stories. Prasad, you want to say something?
There is a lot of metal which gets extracted from a variety of mines in east and south of India, and this metal then travels to China and gets processed, and then becomes parts of machines and electronics, and some of it kind of gets into various kinds of phones and toys and devices, and then they either come back in processed form or they go somewhere else. And once they go somewhere else, then they also kind of get dumped there, and then they come back again. So that also happens. So in like the material kind of have those strange circuits which move through, and when they do that, they create those possibilities for capital, for power, for politics to kind of take place. And the stories, like Rupali said, in their own kind of quirky, semi-fictional ways, try to hold these things, and these journeys, these itineraries of these materials, and the narratives that are there in the work, in the publication, and when they hold it, they kind of they also kind of point at the various things, but again, like Rupali said, the where one can see these larger economic dimensions getting unfolded, or the political dimensions getting unfolded, you see the quirky, strange, instinctual desires, urges which are at operation, strange kind of, and these objects pass through them, and it is here where that movement of these materials kind of hold these desires of humanity. So I think that was what was interesting in talking about these journeys and itineraries and the desires, so and how the work came about, really. And we've been kind of doing this work since like at 4 years ago we were tracing the production of mobile phones, because a lot of things which were coming, parts were coming from China, they were getting assembled here, and then kind of and the assembly was happening not in big factories but in smaller units, some houses, some kind of, so that was happening. Then there was a regulation which kind of acted on this, and then that stopped, and then a whole series of things. But the movements continued, and when the movements continued, they carried many things with them. So that was the fun of the objects. Like they tell the story of humanity in very interesting ways, and they smudge the global, local, inside, outside, private, public, categories.
Thank you, Prasad. And thank you, Rupali. Then maybe I take what Rupali was saying about the hybridity of facts and fictions to move to the third dialogue, which sees Jing He next to me and Liam Yang in the screen. Hi, Liam.
Hi.
Hi. Nice to have you.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here. Well, not here. Great to be on the Zoomscape.
We thought that the title for this small short conversation is in between indeed fact and fictions, because both of the project of Liam and Jing, they indeed stretch through the media of architecture, 3D modeling, sculpture, making, thinking, this questioning where are we living and where we will potentially live. Not necessarily giving solutions, actually not at all, but more like opening up reading from contemporary facts. And I think what is the project of Liam Yam is called Planet City, and the project of Jing He is called Arches of Triumph. And I think it's a nice inversion of plurality and singularity, because we live in a million cities, but the Arch de Triomphe is indeed one typology of a monument. So the fact that Liam looks at the future, this speculative scenario in which the people and the ecosystem is built around one city only, while Jing somehow dissect and disrupt and reconstruct the Arch de Triomphe into a seriality, or we don't even know how many potentially. So I think that the first question is looking at, so you bring us something we don't know. You bring us a theater of potential everyday life. What do you think is the fictional role within the pieces that we had to, that we encounter? And also, what's the role of fiction within imagining potential futures? Liam, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, essentially, I mean, I'm trained as an architect, but I mean, I'm based here in LA. We tell stories and build worlds about the global urban and architectural implications of technology, and we kind of moved our practice from, you know, the traditions of making building into storytelling, because we believe that fiction, as you describe, is really an extraordinary shared language. You know, in many cases, it's how our culture shares and disseminates ideas. And in this context, to sort of encode the mediums of fiction with critical ideas about our cities and our future, hopefully we're able to connect audiences with those ideas in a way that the traditional mediums of architecture, and certainly, you know, the coded languages of drawings, diagrams, can't. Fiction is accessible in a way that those systems sometimes cannot be. And if we're talking about, you know, our future, which is a collective enterprise, you know, then we use, you know, the capacities of popular media or fiction to try and have those broader discussions. So, you know, personally, Planet City is a fiction shaped like a city, and it's trying to generate a conversation around the necessary lifestyle changes that may be required in order to sustain human life on this planet. It's a provocation. It's really, you know, to say that in many ways, climate change is no longer a technological problem. You know, for the most part, a lot of the solutions and the systems required to dig us out of the hole that we've created for ourselves are already here. They just lack the cultural investment or the political will to roll them out at scales that are meaningful. So architectural projects that engage these questions with a kind of technological solutionism. Hey, here's a building, we've solved the problem. Here's a green roof and a new technology, we've solved the problem. Kind of miss the point. So fictional projects and speculations can operate in a cultural sphere, which is, I think, the bleeding battleground of climate change right now. So that's why we made Planet City, and that's why we make fictions, I think, because hopefully they can work in this way and generate these kind of discourses.
Thank you, Liam.
Yeah, I think fiction just give me a kind of space to my imagination, of course, and it's also kind of allow me to put some extreme scenario or offensive image in the story. Like, for example, in the work, in my story, one of the I don't know, these arches of triumph, they will happen in the future, but maybe they're kind of just from a parallel world. And for example, in my story, I said maybe one day the Arc of Triumph in Paris will be destroyed, and the fragment will paste on the copy of the Arch of the Triumph in my hometown in China, or one day the statue in Pyongyang will become a hotel. Probably some people will really hate this kind of story, but fiction gave me a chance to put this image in, and also maybe a little bit humor to let audience access to my words. Yeah.
And how the notion of randomness plays a role, which indeed it looks potentially around a machine of randomness, how these arches are generated, but indeed it's not potentially, because you are the factual aspect and how you extract and reapply or invent through fiction. It's curated by you.
Yeah. I think during the making these works, I have this struggling, like, should I decide everything by myself, or I find kind of a system, like, to let things happen. Of course, like, so randomness is quite important in this system. And later I kind of be fascinated by the movement of geography. For example, like in earthquake, like everything has been destroyed, and also destroy the current order, and the matters from the underlayer have the chance to come up, which give the new possibility. But also this kind of force cannot controlled by human. So I also want to create this kind of system for myself to let randomness happen, and so I can put the fragments from the reality about troubles, about issues, like in this system. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, but yeah, this is more about my methodology of making, like, yeah.
And I think in both projects there is this idea of interconnection but also fragmentation. So also, Liam, within this friction of one ecosystem full of different elements and people, how also for you random played a role, but also how the friction between closed and open played also a role within the Planet City writing, making, and construction as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, Planet City is exploring interconnectedness in the sense that everyone is in one place at one time. So it's the very definition of connected, I suppose. But the point of Planet City is to a provocation around the idea of consolidating human development as a means to relieve pressure on the natural systems that surround it. We've been very good at marking out territory for systems of extractive capitalism. What does it mean to mark out territory distinctly, to leave it alone? So, I mean, I guess in that sense, we're interested in open and closed systems, in that, the city itself is one contained environment whose job it is particularly to leave openness for a certain act of rewilding that might happen on other territories. But, unlike other kind of science fiction cities that might take on similar narratives, there's no giant wall around the edges of the city. Rather, it's not about kind of these captives maintained within the city, never able to go back outside the walls. But we imagine that, we relate to certain parts of the landscape like we do a national park. We can go in incursions through it, but we tread lightly. We take everything that we bring with us away with us, and we imagine that stewards would remain on the land. Indigenous relationships to the land would be not just maintained but given back. Like an act of reversing Western colonialism returning stolen lands as a gesture of remediation and rewilding, and giving back space for other things that certain acts of contemporary urbanism have eroded. There's, I guess there is closed systems, but there's an interconnectedness in the sense that there's relationships between the city and the other lands that it affords outside of itself.
Is that an utopia, dystopia?
It's a utopia and dystopia at the same time is the idea. I mean, really, what Planet City is about is the idea that we all already live in a kind of planetary scaled city, right? We all already living out a dystopia, playing in real time. We have urbanized the planet for every inch of it. Either any condition is either a function of the city or produces the city. So we're already living in that condition. I guess what we're talking about is a provocation around what it means to reorganize our urban development, to degrow based around a different set of priorities that doesn't put ourselves at the center of the conversation, but rather leaves space for other species and leaves space for other types of relationships to land that sit outside of the Western paradigm of city making.
I mean, in some ways, Liam, your provocation with Planet City is kind of binary in the sense that there's you've divided the planet into the human world in this one city and kind of everything else for everyone else, which is a kind of like an amazing sort of didactic or provocation, as you say. But within that city, though, you are talking about kind of transcending the impulse towards techno-solutionism and this sort of almost Western, as you call it, but let's say also kind of totalizing notion of design's role in I don't know. We can't even talk about solving problems anymore because we know that the problems are too complex to be solved, right? But that's one of the things that the city in Planet City is trying to convey, if I'm understanding correctly, is that this is also like a cultural endeavor with all the sort of layers and contradictions and so on and so forth that go with that. And Jing, what's great about your project is that you're kind of speculating about the future, but what you're sort of what you bring into it, as Martina mentioned earlier, is the notion of randomness and chance, right? The idea that speculating, when we speculate about the future or try to predict the future, we inevitably follow a linear line of thinking. But what reality tells us is that all sorts of black swan events and unexpected, unpredictable things factor in that completely change the course of everything. I mean, this pandemic is an example. So, for both of you, I mean, these different takes on different logics, or you're both asking us all to sort of rethink our logics in some ways, and. How do you see this as applying to design practice, or does it? Like, does it say something about how designers should be thinking?
Should I say?
Yes, please. No, I think he's muted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the critical act of designers right now is to rethink the logics of how we've been doing things, right? Like there cannot be a business as usual. It's just a path to madness and ultimate extinction. So I think all projects should be kind of undoing contemporary logics and remaking new logics. And I guess that's really what we're trying to do with the work. I mean, I think Planet City as an idea, as a proposition, is absolutely bonkers and a total disaster to put everyone in one place. But the point is just to talk about I don't know, I guess the end of human-centered design, right? Like we normally use that catchphrase in design terms as a way of describing sort of tree-lined streets with cafes spilling out and shared pedestrian zones. But really, the problems that we're in is because of generations of putting ourselves and our own desires at the center of all the decisions that we make. Planet City really is an act of like carbon-centered design or forest-centered design, wetland-centered design, whooping crane-centered design. So I think that idea of like reimagining the goals, objectives, and desires of what we do as a design community is fundamental. And this is just one sort of provocation on how we might start to think about that. But ultimately, if we can get these systems working at the scale of 10 billion people, Planet City is a fiction, yes, but it's worked out with a bunch of scientists and technologists, so that all those systems are believable in a way, in a form. Not to say let's go and do it, but rather if we can get it working at that kind of scale, then literally the only thing stopping us rolling it out at the scale of Los Angeles or Lisbon is our own prejudices, blind spots, and contradictions and complexities. So yes, I think it's very fundamental in the design community to reimagine logics.
Thank you, Liam. Jing, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think I really agree with Liam, and because he said, I also think design is always very human-centered. Like in this project, I was inspired by the force of nature, and because I find that because this is the force that does not take human into account. So that's what I want to learn. And of course, we have experienced a very long modernism illusion that the whole planet is our resource of economy. And so I kind of imagine design can think about more relationship between human and our surroundings, and without always putting human at the center. But of course, I think it's very difficult. For me, it's also a very difficult question because although I with the design education background, I almost never design anything, I think. Yeah, that's it.
I think we have a few of those here. Turkey might be the exception, right, at the moment. All right, cool. Well, we're almost out of time. I don't know if there are any other.
I think we need to close.
Yeah.
It's almost time.
Okay. Well, I mean, really, thank you, everyone. Liam, this idea of undoing that you sort of ended with I found really super interesting, and the question of can we actually undo, or is undoing another layer of doing, and that sort of also prompted me to remember sort of Ron's statement about how the teeter-totter walls actually, by adding something, they were dismantling something, or trying to dismantle something, and I think these are really great examples of the kind of inherently contradictory phenomena that we all see kind of working at once, right? And now that, and in many ways, all of your projects are about dismantling something or dismantling notions about certain things in certain contexts, and then the question is always, what do we do once we've dismantled it, or in the act of dismantling, what are we actually creating? Prasad, I loved your question about what happens to all those smashed TVs, and it sounds like a whole other project to me, because in China things are getting smashed and burned all the time, depending on how we're feeling about South Korea or Japan or Nike and H&M at the moment. And I'm sure Ron and Virginia will remember the 1980s when U.S. congressmen were smashing Japanese. Smashing through the windows of that building earlier this year. But In any case, I think we should probably thank all of you for joining us. We really want to thank Bea and her whole amazing team at MAT. We forgot to mention, of course, our exhibition and graphic designers bureau, who collaborated with all of you on your installations. And Joanna Pestana and Max Ryan, who did the amazing graphics. And I don't know, Martina, are we forgetting anything?
No, I think we said more or less everything. And I also really like, I took notes of break the logic of how we do things, undoing and remaking, what Liam was saying. I agree with you, it's a fantastic clothing that is more or less in all the projects in a way. No, more than thanking the museum and all the team and the effort to having us physical and online simultaneously all together, I think that's also one of the most important things, together with the participants of the show, you guys that have been following since months and the process.
And thank you, Ron and Virginia, for coming all the way from Oakland to Lisbon.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Yes.
So good to see everyone.
Yeah, and Jing also. I mean, the Netherlands isn't quite as far away, but it's still really good of you. And to the audience at MAT and the audience online, really thank you, and hopefully all of us can see each other in real life soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you, guys.